Good morning, everyone. My name is Ole Jakob Sending. I'm the Director of Research here at NUPI. It gives me great pleasure to introduce this seminar on the Sahel. Not only is it extremely important for the humanitarian challenges in the region, but it's also important for the broader questions that arise in the region about security and political developments. Here at NUPI, we are now beefing up considerably our research on the Sahel, spearheaded by Morten Bøås, who I will introduce in a second, and Francesco Strassari in the back. We also have an initiative that I would like to mention briefly, together with our colleagues at the Christian Michelsen Institute in Bergen and PRIO here in Oslo, called the Norwegian Center for Humanitarian Studies, which is aimed at bringing together scholars in different research institutions to conduct research on humanitarian issues, because although Norway is a big humanitarian donor and actor, there is not that much research on humanitarian policy, and we want to do something about that. I'm very glad to see that there are representatives both from the academic community and from humanitarian organizations. In an interest of time, I will speed up and now introduce the speakers. And our first speaker, our keynote, is Robert Piper. We're very glad to have you here. He is Assistant Secretary General and Regional Humanitarian Coordinator for the Sahel. He joined the UN in 1990. Have worked in the UNFPA, the UNDP, both in the field and in headquarters. He has been resident representative both in Kosovo and Nepal. He is a graduate of the Australian National University in Canberra. After Piper's presentation, we will hear from Morten Bøås. Over here, he recently joined NUPI. He's a research professor focusing on conflict research and a particular focus on Africa. After that, we will hear from Titus Tenga. He's the international director of the Strømme Foundation. He came to that position after stints at the Oslo University College and from a broad array of international consultancy work, including for the World Bank, UNICEF, and NORAD and DFID. With that, I will just like to give the floor to Robert Piper. Again, it's a real pleasure to have you here, and we look forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Shall I stand up first?
Yes, please.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for finding time to join us today. And apologies for being a little late. It's just started already a previous meeting that we ran over time. So thank you very much for your presence, and it's a great pleasure to be here and to visit NUPI for the first time and to learn a bit more about your organisation and to have a chance to tell you a little bit about what we're doing and to bring you up to speed a little bit on the latest from the Sahel. I always start any meeting explaining who I am because it's not so obvious what I am doing. There are many humanitarian coordinators around at the country level who are very much operational, managing teams, managing humanitarian response. But for Syria and for the Sahel, the UN has sort of experimentally created these regional humanitarian coordinator roles. I'm obviously one of them. It's not operational. I don't have a budget. I don't have a big office. My role is much more to get some coherent strategy across the region to advocate for the work of the humanitarian teams in the 9 countries that I cover, to get to deal with the cross-border problems, to get some common approaches to that, to represent the Sahel in some of the international discussions, but especially to represent the humanitarian agenda in these many strategy discussions around the political or terrorism or etc., to make sure that the humanitarian dimension is not lost in all of that. So it's a temporary role. It's for a few years. It's not a permanent. Very effectively in 2012 to the crisis. And going into 2013, naturally, there was this sort of hope that, well, you know, the worst is behind us, and now we can have a couple of years off before the next kind of crisis comes along in the Sahel. But unfortunately, we haven't been able to take our foot off the accelerator, and this is a little bit the theme of kind of what I want to talk about this morning. Going into 2013, the Sahel remains a region in crisis. Even with reasonably good rains, even with reasonably good agricultural harvest forecasts. Why? And you know, this is the big debate. For sure, it's a region in crisis. This is the map of food insecurity indicators across the region, and we have over 11 million people food insecure across the region, with the most acute indicator in Mali, particularly in the north of Mali. How can so many people be hungry even when agricultural forecasts are reasonably good? Well, first, we're finding a very big caseload of people we're working with are still recovering from last year's drought. They're still reeling from last year's event. And it's important to remember last year's drought came only 2 years after the last one. And these events seem to be getting closer and closer together. So we've got this rolling caseload of people that are barely getting back on their feet from last year, and they're still needing emergency assistance this year. We've got food insecurity because prices remain still very high across the region. We think that the 2008 food price sort of crisis was the apex point, and we don't talk about that anymore. But prices still remain very high across the region, 45, 55%, depends on the marketplace, depends on the month of the year. But prices remain very, very high across the region, 50%, say, above the last 5-year average. That hasn't really come down so dramatically. And insecurity is part of the story as well. Northern Mali insecurity, it's a big market for Nigerians to sell their livestock. Nigeria produces half of the region's food, and it had big floods last year. There's a whole host of factors, but the bottom line is prices are not going down. And because we feel people don't need much of a push to go over the edge. We've got this very large caseload of people that have been hit repeatedly by crises getting closer together, and it's very easy for them to fall over this line into a sort of emergency levels, and it takes a lot longer than most people think for them to recover. This is a map. This is a graphic from a study that the World Food Programme did in Niger. And if you look at this line, the Tahua line, the one that goes highest, it's just one of the regions that they looked at. You can see this was essentially the WFP developed a methodology for looking at coping strategies, and so measuring when families were having to use this sort of extreme coping mechanisms to survive for whatever reason, whether it's a flood or a drought, etc. And you can see in some of the least resilient parts of Niger, then this higher grey line, that the sort of use of coping mechanisms, these are going up exponentially very high, and that it's taking almost 3 years for this line to come back to some level of normalcy. So you can see how they're activating all of these sort of emergency family coping mechanisms, selling livestock, taking girls out of school, taking on loans, etc. These are the sorts of coping mechanisms that rational families use all over the world in these circumstances. But they're in order to recover from an event in 2008, they're taking 3 years essentially to go back to where they began, and even then, not exactly where they began. The line doesn't return. So still over 11 million food insecure people across the region for a variety of reasons. We still have 5 million acutely malnourished children across the Sahel. Again, in this case, it's an even higher number than last year. Again, no drought, the harvests are reasonably good. How can we have such high numbers of malnourished children across the region? Well, again, we talked about prices. That's a huge part of is where this therapy is being provided. This is the fastest growing part of the world in terms of demographics. Niger has a fertility rate of 7.6. It's the highest fertility rate in the world. The population is doubling every 22 to 23 years. That's just a lot more children to be served by the health and education system, etc. And that's just creating a momentum of its own, which we really have to wrestle with. And nutrition rates or malnutrition rates remain pretty high because these other services that have a lot to do with malnutrition, like access to good clean water, access to healthcare and so forth, these indicators remain still pretty low, and so in turn they're contributing to high malnutrition rates. And this is one of the themes on our humanitarian appeal that we keep coming back to. Please help us not only on food but also on say access to water and sanitation and health if we're going to reduce next year's caseload on the food insecure or the malnourished. So we've got high levels still this year of food insecure people. We have even higher levels of malnourished children than last year. And we have the Mali crisis, of course, which is starting to look a little better maybe than it did, not maybe, it definitely looks better than 6 months ago. But this is unfolded in 2013. It's displaced 500,000 people during the course of the last 18 months, I suppose, 12 months. 170,000 of them cross borders into neighbouring countries, and we have to look after, obviously, those refugees as part of our humanitarian work. 300,000 internally displaced inside Mali itself. We forget about Chad in a lot of our analysis, but Chad has received more refugees in the last 12 months from Darfur than it has in the last 5 years. It's the highest rate of movement into Chad. People have shown up from Central African Republic. Nigerians are starting to trickle out of northern Nigeria into Cameroon, into Niger. Significant. I mean, it's a trickle still, but we hope that the trend doesn't continue. Food insecurity, acute malnutrition, people on the move. So over 1 million people, 1.1 million people on the move across the region from Chad to Mali in terms of displacement internally or as refugees. And we've had the annual epidemics. We had yellow fever outbreak in Cameroon. We've had malaria crisis in Chad today, cholera epidemics in Niger, and so forth. So a year better than 2012, without question. We had 18 million food insecure people in 2012. We're down to 11 million, but this is still a massive caseload in terms of humanitarian work. So we can hardly take our foot off the accelerator, unfortunately, and sort of declare victory. Our appeal for this year that we launched was a $1.7 billion humanitarian appeal. You'll be familiar with the way we work in terms of our annual planning processes. It is today about 50% funded. Outside, we track the funding going to projects that were identified inside the appeal, and about half of the funding has come. But in addition to that, so the story is not such a bad one, there's another 300 million or so of money, in fact 350 you can see pledges, so that's promises that are not yet maybe translated into projects, but that's solid money. And 294, almost 300 million outside the appeal, but which is targeting the same people that we care about mostly in the appeal. So we celebrate that, and when we look at that money and factor it in, it's probably closer to 70% funding for the humanitarian appeal. Norway, I should mention, is number 13 on the list of donors, so it's an important player as well. 70% is pretty good, considering that Mali's not, the Sahel is not in the headlines in terms of a drought and these sort of dramatic images that people saw in 2012. We continue to have trouble with getting these balanced responses. We make the case to humanitarian donors, I'm sure you've heard this before, that it's great that we get such a relatively good response on food and nutrition, because a couple of days ago the 2 Chadian peacekeepers and a civilian were killed in an incident. So it's a fragile security, but it's, again, I think light years better than it was 6 months ago. So there's been tremendous pledges in Brussels. I've never seen this before. $1 billion more than was requested was pledged in Brussels at a donor conference in May. We have a president with a mandate to really negotiate some of the tough issues that are in front of Mali, and there's certainly some very big ones. We're in a bit of a race to re-establish services in northern Mali so that people will come back, but also that people feel that something is changing fundamentally and that services are becoming available. We're talking about health, education, electricity, water, banking, policing. These things are still very, very fragile. About half the schools were reopened. Last time I looked, I'm waiting for statistics from this week because it was the return to schools on Monday, in fact, so last Monday. I'm still waiting to get new numbers of how many schools managed to open their doors last Monday when the return to school in the north happened. But half the health facilities were inoperative a couple of months back. A lot of these services were destroyed by these forces as they left the region, as they were pushed out. So the banking was re-established only a few weeks ago in Timbuktu. So we are in a real race to re-establish these services. But the displaced people are returning. They're voting with their feet. About 160,000 internally displaced people have, we believe, returned to the north now. And so it's a big pull for them. Or a way of keeping them there, of course, is to make sure that they have access to basic services. There's a 2-week waiting list for a bus ticket from Bamako, so that gives you an idea of the demand for people to move. The refugees, on the other hand, are not moving at this stage. So it's a different ethnic group. They left at a different point in this crisis, and we don't expect to see them move too soon. But there's going to be pressure in the next month because of legislative elections. The next election will be legislative elections, and refugees will not be able to vote from outside the country in the way they did for the presidential one. They were able to vote from the refugee camps, although very few did. But so for the legislative one coming up, that's going to be a push to get refugees maybe to head home, hopefully. And it worries us in terms of the security conditions in which they may go back to. But Mali's going to remain and continue to be a pretty key operation going forward when we think about 2014, which is only a few months away now. But the chronic needs of the Sahel in terms of food security and malnutrition, unfortunately, don't appear to be going away anytime soon. I put a graphic together. I've been in this job 8 months and just trying to understand where we've come from and what the trend line is in terms of humanitarian needs. And this is a graphic that looks at 2004 till today in terms of annual needs, and it's an enormous exponential line upwards, tragically. 200 million in 2004, $1.7 billion in 2013. And you'll notice that the line keeps going up. Even without big drought events, the problem isn't going away. You notice how steep the rise is. You notice that the gaps between these sort of weather events seems to be getting shorter. And that's a big issue in terms of giving time to people to recover before they get hit by the next one. It's becoming pretty obvious to us that we have a repeat caseload of people who are coming back to our humanitarian services, if you will, our appeal every year. We don't have enough data to back this up, I don't think, so we need to be a little more rigorous about it. But it seems to be the same communities, many of the same families showing up from one year to the next. And there appears to be this growing chronic vulnerability in the Sahel that is a new phenomenon in the sense that our models are still based on this assumption that I started with, which was good weather, good harvest, reasonably good, or reduced poverty this year, reduced vulnerability this year. And that only works to a point. It does work, of course. It's not an irrelevant equation, but it's brushing over now this chronic vulnerability that is much more affected by prices, by population growth, by these numbers with the governments concerned. We've had problems in the past with us using different numbers to governments, and that confuses donors. So we're moving the launch till February instead of December. We're going to do a 3-year strategy instead of a 1-year strategy for the next humanitarian appeal for the Sahel. And that's important too, because we have to take on greater responsibility as humanitarians for reducing the caseload, and that takes more than 6 to 12 months to do. So we're really now going to push our plan out. We will still do annual needs assessments. We will still produce annual budgetary figures and so forth. But we're definitely still report annually on results. But it's going to be based now on a 3-year vision rather than a 12-month one. So we can use our time more valuably, I think. We're also going to try and move to a new budgeting system. I don't know if those of you that know a lot about the appeals will know that the way we arrive at $1.7 billion is basically by adding up all of the project profiles that are done in the last stage of the appeal process. We add up all these project profiles, it equals 1.7 billion, and that is the needs of the region. It's not terribly satisfactory. It's the last phase of a cycle to put these projects together. People are very busy at that stage, running out of time. Many projects are never funded, so the level of attention to detail put in those profiles isn't really there. The level of investment to make sure that they don't replicate each other and so forth is not really there. So the number is a pretty loose number. We don't feel really good about. So what we are hoping to do for the next appeal cycle is switch to a formula basis. So we will document what it costs to treat an acutely malnourished child in Chad versus Mauritania and Senegal, and we will times that by the number of beneficiaries that we've targeted in the first place. We will work out what it costs to provide food or vouchers to a person in Niger, etc. We'll times that by the number of people. It will be just a notional number, but probably more accurate than the current system. And again, it frees up time to invest in more productive pursuits. So this is our thinking. So the first thing we're doing is to really rethink a little bit the humanitarian appeal process to respond to a chronic emergency situation like the Sahel. The second thing that's going on is a lot more work at integrating different parts of the puzzle. You may have heard about the UN integrated strategy for the Sahel that was presented to the Security Council in June, but it looks at the governance and state building parts of the problem in the Sahel, secondly at the security and border issues, and thirdly at the crisis and resilience questions for the region. So we're trying to, you can see there that really cuts across all of the UN systems capacities. The very fact that the Security Council wants to talk about resilience and so forth is a kind of encouraging signal that people recognize the problems are pretty multidimensional. But it's also about bringing different actors together. So the Secretary General of the UN will visit the Sahel next week, next week, or in the coming couple of weeks, and he'll do that with the President of the World Bank and very senior people from the African Development Bank, the African Union, and so forth. So there's a big group of people coming together over sometime in November to visit the region. So integration, revisiting the appeal, integrating the different parts of the puzzle, and then thirdly, really coming at this resilience issue, which is a bit of a buzzword, but is increasingly turning into a very useful concept for us to pull our different communities together and get very clear about the ultimate goal of our work, whether we're humanitarian or developmental, which is to reduce the caseload so that we're not needed, in the case of humanitarians and development people, so we're not needed tomorrow. We need to reduce the structural vulnerabilities that are creating these kinds of numbers. We need to strengthen the coping mechanisms of different households, of course. We need to strengthen our response so we can move faster and reduce the period in which people are recovering and so forth. I think humanitarian actors across the region are recognizing a lot more that they have to take some responsibility, not only for saving lives, which is their primary function, but also for making the people they work with safer, making them safer, trying to contribute to reducing somehow. So this is the right message. This is development money focusing on the most vulnerable people in these societies, not necessarily the ones that we would catch in our poverty programs, because they really are even below in terms of access and very hard to reach, very hard to assist in terms of their not having assets and so forth. I insist that resilience isn't necessarily about more money. I don't think it necessarily we have to create great new funds and so forth. It's a lot more about getting better targeting, a shared analysis of who it is that deserves our attention above all, whether we're development people or humanitarian people, a more sharing of data. Literally, I want to see the files, and I've been 25 years in the UN system. I've never seen the humanitarian community, which claims to work with correctly the most vulnerable people in a given country. I've never seen the humanitarian community give those files and that data to the development actors to say, here we are, here are the households we work with, here's where they live. Please put them at the center of your plans. We don't do that. That cross-fertilization doesn't happen so naturally. And we've talked about it a lot. We get stuck in lots of seminars and writing lots of reports about it. It has to get really concrete. We've documented this resilience bridge with humanitarians on one side, development on the other, and the keystone in the middle is really about vulnerability and risk analysis. It's getting a shared understanding of who's at the center of this work, and I think that's kind of an exciting breakthrough that has come because resilience is sort of an accessible way for all of us to get engaged. So let me finish on that. I'm looking forward to questions and discussions and listening to some of the other commentators. But my key message, obviously, is that the region remains a region that's really in crisis. We're not out of trouble yet. It's going to take a lot more than one agricultural season to reverse, one good agricultural season to reverse these numbers. Food prices have got everything to do with the vulnerability in the region, as well as a volatile climate. Second, these events seem to be getting closer and closer together. So families that take 2 to 3 years to recover from the last one are getting hit by the next disaster before they have time to get back on their feet. And that's just creating this increasingly large group of very, very vulnerable people in this part of the world. Third, we do know what to do. We're not lost, we're not overwhelmed. We can see how emergency workers can work smarter, humanitarians can work smarter to reduce next year's caseload. We've got a good idea of some of the development interventions that can make a difference. Not that there isn't room for innovation, new ideas coming along all the time, which is great, but we do know what to do. We just need to translate, above all, some of these ideas into action. But the big expectation on our side is that governments in the region, who of course have got to take the lead, they're putting this as a priority, that these families are becoming political priorities for these politicians and bureaucrats as well, that the people we're losing sleep about are the same people that governments in the region are putting at the top of their lists. So with that, let me thank you for your attention. I hope I haven't talked for too long, and look forward to listening to the other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Titus, please.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. And now we are moving from the broader perspective and coming, as I did from NGO, I'm going to give much more of the NGO perspective into this crisis. But perhaps I should first start by introducing myself My name is Titus Tenga, and I work as International Director for Strømme Foundation. Strømme Foundation perhaps needs to be introduced here. It is a development organization. We are not humanitarian. We are a development organization. And we work in 4 regions across the globe. We have 2 regions in Africa. One we called East Africa region, with our regional office in Kampala, where we work in 4 countries: Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, and Southern Sudan now. The second region is, but let me take you very through quickly into what do the community say to be the possible causes of this. How do I operate this? Do I do it from here? This one, yeah? Okay. Yeah, okay. First, as it has been said here, lower than average rains and excessive rainfall also results in floods, like what has been said in Nigeria. Harvest generally has dropped. If you talk to the community, this is what you hear. Harvest has really dropped, and they have become very unreliable now. And as what you have said, it has been said here, even when the harvests have been good, still there is a huge number of children that are malnourished in these regions, and for many years. Yeah. But I fully agree with what Robert said here. The main cause is this: when you talk to the communities, the unstable market prices, which really pushes the food prices very, very high. Yeah. But of recently, we have also seen this crisis in Mali. For us, has bring a lot of strain. Refugees from northern Mali who are now fleeing, some of them south, but some of them are going to the other countries. This has also brought a lot of problem. But there is another thing that we've just heard now of recently, and this has to do with this locusts. And here is where, like you said, Robert, here, which I think is very important, and this perhaps is one of the role that your office has to take, the connection between this to the larger policy formulation at the international level. In the past, during the Gaddafi, locusts who are really affecting farming in these Sahel regions are really being formed in the desert area. And during the Gaddafi period, Gaddafi used to provide the fund for this. But now, when we go, actually communities are telling us, with the gone of Gaddafi, these funds are not there. And there has been...
Control them.
Yeah, to control them, yeah. To control them, yeah. So with the dissolution of the Gaddafi government, these funds have dried up, and people have already started seeing the cycle of these locusts coming back again. And actually, we also confirm this at the FAO office in Niger. So that is just a nutshell. I don't need to repeat what has been said here excellently. These are the main challenges that we, even as the NGO from the ground, we see from the community. Consequences. Again, this is just a repetition that I can just run away through. Farmers and their families cut down on the expenses. Coping mechanism that Robert has mentioned here. And the most common one is this of selling the assets, selling of the livestock, selling of the personal assets. And Robert, I'm very happy to hear that you have also realized that once a household sell their asset, I'll come back to this in a diagram later, like a cow. Actually, what you are doing is you are killing the economic base of the whole household. And the consequences is that to really regain that, I'm really happy that you have noted that, it takes years. So it's not just a question of 1 year or 2 years, And also there are many coping mechanisms, like men, women, children also look for additional work to supplement the family income. Very natural coping mechanism. And what they do, they usually migrate. Most usually in the region, especially in Niger and Burkina Faso, most usually used to go to Ivory Coast and Libya. But with the conflict now in Libya, most of these people have returned home. Yeah. Our own statistic in the community that we have worked, about 200,000 workers have returned home, and this has really increased the challenge in the food security. So that is just a nutshell of the consequences of the food crisis. Now, when it comes now to the solution, but more and more, we also see that it has also to do with the women rights, women empowerment, yeah? Especially on the ownership of the assets. At least it can be long, teaching people nutrition, all this, But maybe another thing that you touched a little bit, Robert, here, needs to be emphasized here is also this is the last item that I put here, addressing this rural-urban migration, which is also a big problem in the countries. And this is not only in Sahara countries, but this generally is the main problem mainly of African countries because of the, if you like, the unproductiveness of the rural setting of the agriculture. Because of the economic might of agriculture has gone down, people migrate to the urban cities, and this really increases the strain into the challenge, and especially in the context of Sahara region where you have this irregular, if you call, natural crisis of the food. Now, his organization, what have we done? And here maybe I could start by, Strømme, we thought that given our size, given our focus area, education and microfinance, as I said, we've been forced to come back into this problem because of the rights on the ground. We are operating with the strategy of almost 3 lines of defense. Number one, we are focusing on the household. And here we are trying not only to mitigate, but also to prevent, like what you said, this issue of asset transfer. As I said, for us, at the household there, if you look, a cow, for example, to the household, that is the economic base of the household. So what we are trying to do is to devise a mechanism whereby, how can we help these people, even when this food crisis comes, then they should not sell their crisis. And that's why we are operating mainly not at the household and also at the community level. And at the community level, we are having at least 2 approaches. One is to come back with this new technology, new innovative ways of agriculture that will support the households to continue having their cattle or their assets even during the crisis of the food. And the one approach that we are now piloting is what we call hydroponics grass. I don't know if some of you are aware of that one, are familiar with that one. Are we familiar with that one? This is a new technology whereby you could produce the grasses to feed the cow with very little water. Actually, they are saying that you need 95% less water to produce the same grasses that they can feed on your cows during the crisis. So we are piloting with that one in order that to try to mitigate this selling of asset that is happening when there is a food crisis. So that is one approach that we are doing. And we are doing it with the funding from USAID. Actually, USAID, they're the ones who are promoting it now. The second thing that we are doing at the community, and this to us comes into this focusing on women in particular, it is these groups, what we call the community managed microfinance groups, the women groups. These are the women in the community, about 20, 25, maximum 30, self-selected. They form their group themselves. They put and they devise and they agree on the rules to govern that group themselves. But the nutshell of this group is to encourage them to save and loan within themselves, and they put the terms themselves. Now we are using these groups as try to use already the structure that we have, these ladies, in order to bring in innovative approaches, not only into agriculture setting, but also into trying to preserve their grain for the difficult days of the food crisis. The third layer or line, this is supposed to be national and region. This is the government now. So far, we have not had very much input into this level, apart from maybe our influence in the policies of the country, because we really don't have the muscles and the strength to come there. That's why we are focusing on the community. But I'm very happy to hear that your office, Robert, is also going to work very much into this, trying to support the government initiative. And I was particularly happy that you mentioned this, the 3N, Niger, Nourished Nigerians. I think that is a really important program. And for us, it is very important that, especially these international programs like yours, you should really try to go through those national programs to strengthen them, rather than creating another program like a parallel structure. So, concretely, if I just were to go very concrete, what do we do? At the household and community level, I mentioned them. Job creation through vocational training in agriculture and the livestock, build the capacity to promote good practices and the food security in the rural areas. This is what we do concretely. Yeah. Then we really focus on the girls and the women through economic empowerment and education and literacy. So we are using those CMMF groups as a platform to introduce this new innovative approach. This is what I've been saying. This is one of our microfinance intervention, which is really becoming big, and we are planning to really blow it up. Savings for change. As I said, women about 25, they meet weekly. Ideally is to sit down and they look for the opportunity to address not only savings for themselves, but also use that platform for other things to improve their community. This is an example of the grain bank that we are doing. Community store, and they sell crops to the village members at low price. Income is used to increase the storage capacity of the cereal bank and to support social infrastructure. Actually, we've seen, like when I said in the harvest before the 2012, some of the women, they used the proceedings from the grain bank to build 2 teachers' houses in their school community. So you could see there is a trickle-down effect of that. And the most important for us, why we are really encouraging this, because of what has been said here, and I fully agree. The main challenge, especially during the crisis, is the market, high prices. So for us, this grain bank in the community that we operate, we encourage them because to mitigate, these speculators who are coming and they sell food at extremely high prices during the food crisis. I said it in the introduction, but I can repeat again. Education being one of our main sector of intervention, we have seen clearly that there is no way you can just continue with education without really addressing the food security issue. So we see there is a strong link between food security and child education, and also economic empowerment of the women. And the women are more important for us because, honestly, we have seen it. We are now thinking of maybe doing a study to see a control group study to see what will be the impact of having a similar CMMF group for men, so that we can compare with the men. Because for the women, we've seen it clearly. Immediately when they get any additional income from their group, where it goes, 3 areas. Healthy. They are geared to start at the grassroots. And there is very important because then you involve the people in order to devise the solution for their own problems. And that's why I don't think if it can be said enough that it is very important, in particular for we as NGO, but also the big program from the UN, that they should complement and work through this kind of national programs rather than starting a parallel program that complicates the process. I think this is all what I have to share. All right, thank you.
Great, Titus. Thank you. You've been a very patient audience, but this has also been 2 very good presentations. But I will just give a few remarks, and then I will open it up to the floor, because as I have understood, Robert is supposed to be at our parliament 12:15, so he needs to leave from here no later than 12 o'clock sharp. But that should be sufficient time. Oslo is, after all, a small city, and it's 5-6 minutes from here down to the parliament. Anyway, I think that both these 2 presentations have highlighted many of the issues at stake in the Sahel, and particularly the fact that this is not something, even if there are positive signs, even if there are good responses, even if, and I think that Robert is correct when he says that we, at least on the food security issues and so on, we have an idea about what we should do. It's not always that easy to get it done, but it's not that we are completely lost for solutions to this. But on the other hand, the chronic part of both the ecological issues, the increased, I'm not going to drag us into a debate about climate change, but at least increasingly in this part of the world, climatic variability, which means that seems to indicate both that the droughts are coming at a more rapid pace than they used to, and also the fact that even if there is not necessarily a drought as such, also the seasons seems to have become less predictable, meaning that many of the old coping mechanisms, because we also need to realize that people have been living in this area for centuries after centuries, and they have been living in a very harsh climate, and they have in fact been quite good at coping with this in the past. The Sahel has always been an open and partly uncontrolled space, but not without spaces of governance, and definitely not without people who knew how to live in this area. The problem is a multidimensional problem. Parts of it has to do with this new climatic variability, meaning that which seems to indicate that the droughts are coming at a much more rapid pace, giving people less chance to recover from one crisis to another. But also that we are in fact entering a slightly new political field in this region. So there is also clearly a relationship here between the food crisis and the political crisis in the region. Because it's good to see initiatives like the one that has been taken in Niger. It's good to see that Mali managed to get through at least the presidential election with something that looks more solid than what was there in the past. but there are also fundamental political and security challenges facing this region. And we need to also take that into consideration. Because without states that works and that are able to also introduce local institutions that can help people recover, there is not that much we can do to really make this sustainable. We can help, we can assist, but without that kind of local capacity, it's hard to see that this will be sustainable in the long run. And this is not impossible, but it will be difficult there because it means that these are, we call them fragile or weak, or what we call this, and regional. And even if there are several similarities between the different crises that exist in the Sahel region, I think we also need to acknowledge that all of them are locally grounded and that these states that constitute the nations of the Sahel are both similar but also quite different. So it would be relatively, we need a regional approach, but it needs to be a regional approach that also is fine-tuned to different local contexts. We talk both the previous speakers have talked a lot about coping mechanisms and how we can turn what Robert very correctly defined as negative coping mechanisms. This is about selling assets and so on, which is something I recognize also in my previous work from for instance, from the refugee camps in northern Uganda, where we also saw a lot of these people were selling everything because, one, they think that when we are in crisis, most of us tend to think that it will only last for a short while. And I think this is only normal. This is in a way a survival mechanism. So again, as Robert pointed out, this is in a way it's rational. And what else can you do? You have to take somebody out of school. You have to, if you don't have food, you have to slaughter that cow. If you don't have anything to eat, you eat your seeds. It's as easy as that. But this is also very, of course, negative in the long run. So I think one of the most important questions here is how do we start talking about coping mechanisms in a context of the Sahel, of climatic variability, and also in a context of insecurity. Because yes, the situation, at least in Mali, has improved, but still I think we also need to face up to the fact that we will see also more security challenges in this region for quite some time to come. So what this means is that with droughts that are coming with increased frequency, seasons less predictable, and also these other types of security challenges that we see in this region, it means that old coping mechanisms has become less useful and new one has not emerged, at least not that are peaceful and sustainable. Because when people are trying to survive, they will also look for other alternative means of surviving. And unfortunately, in this region, that has also become the coping mechanisms of possibly joining one armed insurgency or another. Not necessarily because you are so much in agreement with what it stands for, but simply because it has become a coping mechanism, a way of survival. Or turning into various of the criminal enterprises that have infested themselves in this region, trafficking, smuggling, and so on. And a lot more work is needed on this particular issue, I think, to try to map out these coping mechanisms challenges and how that relates to the different political challenges at different levels of the Sahel. And this is also of immense importance for the security challenges in this region, because if you look, for instance, at the strategies that a group like AKIM used in the Timbuktu region, they played this quite skillfully in order to integrate themselves into partly into also local communities by distributing medicines, money, and so on and so forth. And when people don't have any other solutions, not any other else to turn to, they will accept also this from these kinds of organizations. Not necessarily because people agree with them, but they were there and there were not many others that were there. So this is important on almost all levels and all dimensions of the Sahelian crisis. So a lot more work is needed on this, both from the research side and from the practitioner side when it comes to the humanitarian challenges. Mali is off to a new start that is immensely positive, but the challenge that the Sahel poses not only to the people that live there but also to the rest of the world, which was made evident by, for instance, the attack on in Amenas, cannot be solved by military means. The only sustainable solution to the problems of the Sahel is through social development and finding a sustainable solution to the chronic food crisis in this region. So with that, I would like to thank both Robert and Titus for excellent presentation and open up for questions and comments from the floor. Please introduce yourself and at least make your questions relatively short. Yes.
Thank you very much. This was a very interesting presentation, Robert Pfeiffer especially. I enjoyed what you said about the integrated approach, the new strategy for 2014. My name is Birgit Philipsen and I'm working with ADRA. So we're working with development and relief also in the Sahel region. I would like to know a little bit more about concrete thoughts on how you would like to bring together the humanitarian agencies and the development agencies or actors in the field. And also maybe a little bit more about the costing per beneficiary. You mentioned it briefly, this new way of planning, and I would like to know a little bit more about that. Thank you very much.
Should we get some more or just one? Shall I respond to that?
We take one more.
Francesco Strazzari from NUPI. Being Italian, I was often sitting with the UN agencies that are based in Rome, FAO, IFAD and WFP, talking about the food problem in the Sahel. And one of the things that struck me was the fact that there's relatively little study still about on a comparative or even quantitative macro data about the relationship between instability of prices and political instability. There's some pioneering work being done somewhere, but I think the region, the Sahel, lends itself for a macro important study that would cut new ground in understanding how what Morten was just stressing, the fact that we are acting on a humanitarian crisis which is made more complex by political instability is all mediated through the problem of prices, of basic staple. Now there's been some study on the Arab uprisings, but when it comes to this belt, there is less of a knowledge about what we really know about what is a high price. So you rightly said it's like half 50% more than the average of the last 5 years, but then do we have any benchmark for that? I think it would be important to do that, and I would like to ask you a question about this. My perception is that there's little answer given to one macro mistake that was done in some other parts in the world, that is to address problems of food insecurity with no clear understanding of what would happen in case of a maximizing type of seeds that are engineering hybrid seeds or engineered forms of seeds that have been introduced, for instance, in India, in the famous case of cotton and so on. Meaning, let's introduce a type of seed that is resistant to drought, let's say, maximizing production, apparently looks more helping our resilient discourse. But then the problem is that because variability is such, it turns out to be totally non-resistant to floodings. So you get that in a situation where families are dependent on market mechanisms, they are insured only against one type of problem, but not against the other type of problems, and then you end up having tens of thousands of suicides because the market mechanism is squeezing households. So I think it would be interesting to see whether the big UN agencies at some point speak up about good and bad lessons we have learned about technological solutionism in dealing humanitarian crisis, because it would be a disaster if we end up picking the wrong lesson and applying that to such a fragile...
And in development, where people working on safety nets in humanitarian and development. And we didn't have a clear idea about this keystone. So as I said in my talk, for me the keystone is becoming vulnerability and risk mapping. I'll come back to that perhaps. But the lesson I've drawn out of this inventory process is that we do have a lot going on, that we need much more clarity about who does what on this resilience piece. I mean, if we're not careful, resilience will become the third priority of a humanitarian appeal. After early recovery or something, there'll be resilience as number 3, and it will all be pretty meaningless. So if we are to have similar objectives like early warning, both in a humanitarian appeal and in, say, the UN Development Assistance Framework, which is the development tool for then we better make sure we're clear about who's bringing what to the task, and we have a clear division of labour. I think it's fine we both work on early warning systems. I think it's good. But we need to be clear about what it is that emergency people are doing and what it is that development people are doing. And if we get mixed up with that, which is the case at the moment, I don't think it's there's no consistent approach and policy. So concretely then, number one, I'm working with the humanitarians to get clarity about what it is they do on resilience and what they don't do, and we're going to put that into the appeal. With the development people, I'm going through a similar process of forcing them to distinguish between what is truly resilience-friendly work and what is just the bread and butter of development, and making sure that that becomes then a part of their development strategies. And together we're looking at this issue of risk and vulnerability. And for me, a big part of that is the data being shared down to the household level from humanitarians into the development strategy work, so that it infiltrates the benchmark against which development actors judge their success or failure in their plans. So that's very, very, very concrete. What I'm not advocating at the moment is a separate national strategy for resilience that we might work on, which would be an obvious thing to do. But what is going on at the moment in the Sahel is this EU-sponsored alliance called AGIR, which is the Global Alliance for Resilience in West Africa and the Sahel. There's one in the Horn of Africa also, an equivalent. It's more sponsored by the US, and this one is more sponsored by the European Union. But AGIR is a big alliance of actors coming together to work on resilience. And so for me, they're trying to define their work in the context of national strategies. So they're trying very hard not to develop a separate AGIR work program, but in Niger, for example, finding their way into the 3N program. But rather than us promoting now another resilience strategy of some kind, I want us to come in behind AGIR and the government strategies for the next few years and not confuse the issue. So don't expect to see the UN pushing for a national resilience strategy. I mean, we will try and do that through AGIR and not separately. But under the appeal and under the development framework of the UN, we will have our resilience work cut out for us. For humanitarians, it means taking on some of the burden of reducing next year's caseload. It means more money on preparedness, more money developing the capacity of perhaps local NGOs that you're working with. It means more innovation with things like food. WFP is doing some pretty great things with cash instead of food, which is injecting money into the marketplace and so forth. So I think there's some very concrete things that can be done. They're not all new. We're not reinventing. We haven't discovered the wheel or anything like that. I think but nevertheless, there has to be. It's a much more compelling case today to invest in these types of activities, I think. The costing per beneficiary, what I didn't say in my presentation, which I should have, is that this piece of our strategy has not been approved yet, or at least it was, and then it hit a bump. In that this has been done before in Afghanistan and in the DRC in Congo for the humanitarian appeals. The budget and how many people and what we're planning to do. At the moment, you can't work it out. You look at an appeal, then you start reading these reams of project profiles at the back. And the link between the first part of the appeal, which is how many people need help, and the projects and the budget it's impossible to track. So there's some worries about this. Let me acknowledge that there's some legitimate concerns. Some of the agencies are worried that some things will be hard to come up with formulas for. Some of the resilience work in particular. But I've seen some different analysis of what it costs to keep a girl in school for 3 extra years, for example. So there is ways of doing this. It'll be very different by country. We're not going to do it across the Sahel, that's for sure. There are also legitimate worries that we don't have enough time to put this protocol in place before we have to launch. Fair enough. But the biggest worry, or the worry that resonates with me that I don't have a good answer for, is the worry that donors will go to the cheapest option on the menu. So the fact is that, for sure, it'll be more expensive to do a certain activity per capita than something else. I don't have an example for you, but let's say, theoretically, it costs more money to treat a moderately malnourished child versus a severely malnourished child. So let's say that those two, one you can treat twice as many children with the same euro, with €1 as the other. So there is an anxiety that some donors, obsessed with value for money, are going to take the option that gives them the greatest number of beneficiaries that they can report on. And you can see how that would be incredibly unhelpful, right? That would be the wrong way to go, but it's a legitimate worry that we're not quite sure how to deal with. Obviously, I'm bringing it up with all the donors, and everyone says, oh, no, of course we understand, but I think we need to figure it out a little bit carefully. So I'm not sure it will happen yet. I don't guarantee it'll happen for this next cycle. We had agreed we were going to do it, and then we got hit by this global dialogue, so we got caught up in something above our pay grade. Francesco, I think I don't really have any. I think this is a really interesting thing to research. Is how I know that, for example, this French research NGO called run by François Grunewald. Do you know François? I'm not sure. I've forgotten the name. But they're looking at some of these issues around adapted agriculture seeds. Adapted seeds for climate change resilience, and actually promoting a model of seeds in Mali which have got a lower productivity but a much more predictable response in different climatic conditions. And that's one of the things that they think we have to come to terms with, is that high yields seeds are not necessarily the solution when you're looking at risk. So they're arguing that for a farmer is a very poor farmer with a very low threshold and very few coping mechanisms to call on, and an uncertain weather pattern, are probably better placed taking a seed option which has got a lower yield but is more predictable across. And the World Bank has just finished a really interesting analysis on agricultural risk in Niger, where they're kind of asking these sorts of questions. With all the changes in the climate and the uncertainty, you know, one year it's a drought, the next year it's a flood. How do you factor this now into agriculture in countries like Niger? So I think there's a lot of work to do there. I'm not an expert in the field, but I think it's really interesting that. Now on this issue of assets and who's buying them, I've never really thought about it. It's a very interesting question. I don't know, at the village level, someone's buying these livestock, and obviously there's a food chain, as it were. And I showed you a table in one of my graphs of poor and less poor and of families and where they get. So the livestock people have the pastoralists have the opposite problem. They're not getting. There's lots of livestock on the market that is not selling at very high prices. So then they go to the market. They have less purchasing power when they're buying other parts of their food. So it's a complicated picture. I don't have a crisp answer for your question, but we don't have a growing middle class, if that's what some people might think, but that's not the case. There's still very big gaps between. I think in Senegal, where I live, it's perhaps most pronounced. It's one of the most pronounced, where you have a pretty skewed development strategy, that is development results that are producing results for a pretty lucky few at the top, and the vast majority not seeing much change yet, although this government is putting in place some important policies to reverse that.
Titus, you want to add something to this?
No, I think the question that I'd really like to ask you to answer was that one, but I think you've answered it very well. There is where you really need to understand the linkages between the so-called global and the local. In between there is many layers. It is a huge syndicate. These speculators, they are there ready. Actually, they are buying these grains during the harvest, and they restore them, consciously knowing that this thing will come in order to resell them. But most of these products, like we've seen in northern Mali, goats, for example, they end up not even in Mali. They go as far as Middle East, especially during the Eid Ramadan. So it is a huge line of syndicate that is there targeting to the people. When we advise the ladies in our CMMF communities to come with this grain, what we had in mind is in particular to mitigate these speculators, because they really buy and keep them there in the village waiting for the dry season and then selling them at a higher price.
We do. There's a nice FAO program. I think there's a French word called warrantage, which I haven't come across before. I don't think I've fully understood the word, but I understand the projects, which are really clever, which is where they are buying food off farmers at the low prices when they're all selling because they have to buy their inputs for the next agricultural season. But they buy, so it's a community shop, not a bank, but a shop that buys the harvest at the low prices, keeps it in the shop, but sells them what they need for the next season from the shop, keeping the food, of course, as an exchange, but then resells them the food later in the agricultural season, when, if they want, they don't have to, but if they want, they can buy their food, their harvest back at the price that they sold it for, and then they can sell it at a different time of the year. But it hasn't been at the expense of getting their inputs for the next agricultural season. I think it's a very clever way of trying to push up, because everyone's selling at the same time and at the wrong time, of course, as a result. We've got time for a couple of more. Yeah?
Yeah, I think we have. Please.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm Devruk from Bøås. I'm a master's student, final year. I have two questions. The first one is, for decades it seems in Sahel region, the agriculture is done by rain-fed water, rain-fed agriculture. But the reference I took from a study which was done by Berkeley University in California, 95% of the agriculture is done by rain-fed water, and for decades it has been continuing. And for humanitarian issues and for development and such, money has been flowing to the region, but it seems that nothing has done to restore or to develop the irrigation system, which is extremely necessary in order to improve or to decrease the food insecurity and to promote climate-smart agriculture. That's my first one. Number two is, in your UN sector or in your office, how do you involve the people from Sahel region in strategic decision making? I'm asking this because I was in Tanzania this summer.
Partly to do with the recognition of this chronic vulnerability. We're seeing more investment now coming in irrigation, but you're absolutely right, I can't defend it. At the moment it's pretty low. The other question that will come at the same time is irrigation for whom, and that's, there are big corporations, there's some pretty big companies growing, working in the region too in agriculture, and so one of the issues will also be where do you do your irrigation? And in Senegal, again, for example, I know the government's pretty keen on some of these big businesses that are agri-businesses. So we've got to not only promote more irrigation, but we've got to make sure it's irrigation that gets to the smallholders as well. I'm new to the region. I've only been there 8 months, but it is quite amazing to see how there is water in the most extraordinary places. If you follow the Niger River, etc., there is water there. But a lot of the agriculture will happen just on the fringes of these rivers. But there's enough land, and there is enough productive land to feed everyone, of course. So irrigation's a key part of the strategy. And it's been neglected, as has agriculture. It's been appallingly neglected for the last 20 years, really, this whole sector. I think I represent a pretty big family of your question about local involvement. I'm sitting here on behalf of a very big network of organizations, UN and NGOs, that are working at the country level. I'm sitting at the regional level, but we have thousands of people working in every one of these countries at the country level, and many of them not in the capital city even, but much further out than the capital city, although security deteriorates in places like Niger and Mali. We have less people in the field than we did once upon a time, and a lot less expatriates and a lot more nationals in the field than we did once upon a time as well. So it's not ideal, but we've definitely anchored in a lot of local processes, a lot of local government, a lot of national strategies. One thing that strikes me in this part of the world, that compared to some other places I've worked in, is that there is such a strong development contingent in the region that it's much harder for humanitarian work to get away with not involving the government and not working through national institutions. So most of our humanitarian coordinators, for example, in the Sahel, who are also resident coordinators, most of them have got a very strong development background, much stronger than their emergency background, much stronger. So their instincts are very much more about, well, how do we do this through the ministry, and what does the government think before we shoot off into onto the horses and go and solve the problem all by ourselves. So there's quite a lot of pressure, but there's a bit of tension too, because these same development people didn't see a crisis when others did. This is a debate. If you have 5 million malnourished children every year in the Sahel for the last 10 years, is it a crisis? We think of emergencies, crises, as something extraordinary. But it is kind of shocking to say that these kinds of indicators were not considered a crisis. Niger has had malnutrition rates for decades, but we've not had a humanitarian appeal ever in Niger until 2 years ago, ever. we've had some drought appeals at certain times during crises, but these sort of chronic malnutrition rates were considered routine. It's pretty shocking. So there's this kind of dynamic that is out there, which I think is a healthy one, of development type saying, well, you emergency guys, you've come in great numbers in the last few years, and we kind of welcome you, but we look forward to seeing you off, and make sure as you work, you don't undermine the ability of governments to lead and our efforts to build capacity. Yeah. But actually, humanitarians saying, on the other hand, well, look, you people have been asleep at the wheel. We've had this crisis, and you haven't declared it. You have been reluctant to confront governments with the emergency under their noses, trying to be politically correct, etc. It's a real dynamic. Maybe, on
operate the difference such a huge one that you really need to start with women first. At least bringing their base to a certain level, and themselves they will devise ways of going to interact men and bringing men into this issue, because you cannot just bring men and women at the same time and then discuss sensitive issues like these populations, especially in the setting like the West Africa. So that's why we are focusing women as a starting point. And it is true, once the project goes on, it will reach a certain level. The women themselves, if I were to have time, I could have given you an example of one community leader where the women really stood behind one candidate who was nominated for the first time in Mali to the provincial government council. Yeah, so you have to start with the women, not because you want to put aside men, but because the context really demands that. And that provides a forum where also women can discuss sensitive issues like this, malnutrition, population growth, but they need to discuss them themselves. So